In December 2021, at least 21 people died in forests along Poland's Belarus border, pushed back by guards enforcing a zero-tolerance migration policy. The temperature hit -20°C. 4 months later, Poland was processing 50,000 Ukrainian refugees daily through the border town of Przemysl. Population, 60,000. The maths here tells a specific story. Poland's acceptance rate for different nationalities in 2023. Belarusians, 98%. Ukrainians, close to 100%. Middle Eastern and African asylum seekers arriving via Belarus, effectively zero. This isn't an oversight or an administrative quirk, it's policy. And unlike Western European neighbours, Poland's mainstream parties from both right and centre-left have converged on this approach. Even Donald Tusk, the former European Council president who returned as Prime Minister in 2023, announced he would, quote, temporarily suspend the right to asylum to prevent what he called the weaponisation of migration. The political divide has been notable. While Western Europe watches far-right parties surge on anti-immigration platforms, Poland's radical right is barely in double-digit territory. Have you ever Googled yourself? I mean, I definitely have. I think everyone has. I Googled myself even before I was Googleable, or, there's always weird stuff out there about you, no matter who you are. Your name, your address, maybe even your past court records, if you've got them. Hello there. I suppose you could have, civil court things. For a divorce or whatever, right? I always think it's criminal. You've been a naughty boy. Look, your details can just show up on a sketchy site that you've not heard of, and that's when today's sponsor Incogni comes in. It's a service that removes your personal data from the internet, and their unlimited plan now includes custom removals. That means you can submit any site where your data appears, and their team will try and get it taken down, even if it's not in their usual database of 250 plus data brokers, which is a lot of data brokers. Probably isn't one of those, isn't it? But if it's not, well, great. You just copy the link, you paste it into your dashboard, they handle the rest. And if it doesn't work, well, they've got a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you've got nothing to lose. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use the code POLITICALFRONTS at incogni.com/politicalfronts and get 60% off an annual plan. When Europe faced its largest refugee movement since World War II in 2015, Angela Merkel made history when she declared, "We can do this," as she announced a widespread acceptance of what would come to be millions of refugees. In the face of southern European states being overwhelmed by large numbers of migrants arriving on a daily basis, the EU put together a scheme to share the responsibility and take the pressure off the hardest-hit countries by dispersing migrants throughout the continent, known as the quota system. From the beginning, this was controversial in Poland, although the governing centrist government, led by the pro-EU Civic Party platform, initially agreed to accept somewhere between 5,000 and 6,800 refugees. This was not received well domestically, especially among centre-right Poles. Within days, thousands were marching through Warsaw, opposing any Muslim immigration. The message was clear. Jarosław Kaczynski, who led the opposition Law and Justice Party, did not mince words when he claimed Middle Eastern migrants carried parasites that would endanger Polish health. He warned that accepting refugees would completely change our culture and radically lower the level of safety in the country. This rhetoric, however divisive it may be, resonated with significant numbers in the country. Polling showed that over 70% of Poles opposed accepting refugees from Muslim countries, with only 25% being in favour. The images didn't help. As Merkel's decision to open the country's borders was heard around the world, an increasing number of migrants from the Middle East began making their way to Europe. These images often depicted primarily young men, sometimes in considerable numbers, journeying to the continent. Data would later show that about 70% of 2015's asylum seekers were indeed men, and most were under the age of 35. While such narratives didn't capture the full picture, they undoubtedly captured the minds and fears of many in the country. While many were fleeing genuine persecution, the gender imbalance triggered specific anxieties in conservative societies, concerns about security, cultural integration, as well as outright claims of invasion being thrown around. Within months, the right-of-centre Law and Justice Party rode this wave to power, winning an absolute parliamentary majority, the first such case in Poland's multi-party system post-communism. They wasted precious little time after taking office before cancelling the refugee agreement entirely. The European Commission would go on to launch legal proceedings, and the bloc's Court of Justice eventually ruled that Poland, along with Hungary and the Czech Republic, had violated its treaty obligations. But Warsaw didn't care and didn't change their approach. They accepted the fines. To them, paying fines to Brussels was politically cheaper than reversing a key campaign pledge and yielding to supranational courts. For years, they would continue this stance with broad domestic support. This would be put to the test like never before, though, in 2021 when Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko quite literally brought the situation to their border. After Lukashenko's regime had become the target of EU sanctions for stealing the 2020 election, he decided to retaliate by using Middle Eastern refugees as pawns, or as Warsaw saw it, he was engaging in hybrid warfare. He organized flights, bringing Middle Eastern migrants to Minsk, Iraqis, Syrians, Afghans, and then pushed them toward Poland's border, where he wanted them to cross into EU territory to exacerbate the refugee situation there. It didn't take long before thousands were massing at Poland's border, trying to cross into what they'd been told was safety. Warsaw saw this as an attack by Minsk on their sovereignty and responded accordingly, though not without criticism. It declared a state of emergency, banned media from the border zone, deployed 15,000 troops to the border, and built a high-tech wall for starters. Border guards physically forced back anyone who crossed, often multiple times. The country found itself in a difficult position. Accepting the refugees would be playing into Lukashenko's hands and would be seen as a capitulation in response to a clearly dehumanizing effort to use real people as pawns. Yet, denying them access, the path they ultimately chose, came with real consequences as well. Those refugees were not there with hostile intention. They had come completely unaware that they were being used as pawns by Minsk and hadn't exactly brought their camping gear for the cold winter days and long nights. By December 2021, temperatures dropped to minus 20 Celsius. Humanitarian groups documented at least 21 deaths in the first winter, though other estimates skew higher. Recent data suggests that over the years, that number has grown to 130. A pregnant woman gave birth in the forest. Warsaw did attempt to try to send humanitarian aid. They weren't embarking on a campaign of completely turning a blind eye here. They attempted to send on numerous occasions humanitarian aid, tents, blankets, food and medicine directly to those on the Belarusian side of the border, only to be blocked by Minsk's forces time and again. When criticized, Polish officials argued that these people did not qualify as refugees because of how they were being weaponized by Minsk. The distinction mattered both legally and politically. Real refugees qualify for certain protections and rights under international law. Warsaw was effectively arguing that because Minsk was flying them in to create conflict inside the EU, they did not qualify for such protections. These legal gymnastics, it didn't change the terrorizing reality that these migrants experienced, but from Warsaw's perspective, it worked. Lukashenko's attempt failed, parts of the EU backed their tougher stance, and domestically, the government's approval actually rose. Yet this hardline approach isn't always what Poland adopts, despite the reputation it has earned of late. Rather than being anti- or pro-migration, they've just been extremely selective in who they take in, which was put on clear display with their decisions following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So then, Russia invaded Ukraine and Poland flipped the switch. The same border guards who had been pushing migrants away became welcoming committees for Ukrainians, and the same communities that protested refugee centers in 2015 were setting up reception points in schools, churches, sports halls, and private homes. The numbers alone are staggering. In the first 2 months, 3.5 million Ukrainians crossed into Poland. For perspective, when accounting for population differentials, that's the equivalent to the United States accepting 30 million refugees in 8 weeks. The border town of Przemysl that we mentioned earlier, population 60,000, was processing tens of thousands of refugees daily. The train station became a 24-hour operation with signs in Ukrainian, volunteers working around the clock providing hot food, medical care, psychological support, and onward transportation, a system that moved from chaos to remarkable efficiency within days. The efficiency of Poland's Ukrainian response reveals just how different this was from their previous approach to migration. They passed a special law on March 12, 2022, just 16 days after the invasion, streamlining what normally takes months in a matter of hours. The PESEL UKR system gave Ukrainian refugees instant access to work authorization, healthcare, and school enrollment for their children. No lengthy asylum procedures, no bureaucratic maze, just immediate integration into Polish society. The digital infrastructure made the process remarkably smooth. Ukrainian passport holders could open bank accounts, buy SIM cards, and sign work contracts within 48 hours of arrival. Compare this to the typical asylum process, where applicants often wait years for basic permissions, and the contrast becomes rather stark. The government paid Polish families 40 zloty per day to host families, along with a sign-up bonus of 300 zloty. By April 2022, over 700,000 Ukrainians were living in Polish homes, though not all were lucky to move in with a family, with the less fortunate ending up in rather less luxurious temporary flat shares. Poland's rental market was already tight, with Warsaw vacancy rates under 5%. Yet the country avoided the tent cities and refugee camps that typically emerge during mass displacement crises by systematically repurposing buildings across the country. Sports halls transformed into dormitories, hotels dedicated entire floors at government rates, and universities opened student dorms during spring break. Even office complexes were converted into temporary housing units, creating makeshift family accommodations in corporate spaces. The question of who was arriving undoubtedly played a role in how society viewed the situation. A UNICEF report from mid-2022 found that around 90% of refugees were women and children. Ukrainian men, aged 18 to 60, were prohibited from leaving, required for military service. This wasn't the young male migrants of 2015 who triggered security anxieties. These were mothers with strollers, grandmothers with grandchildren, teenage daughters. The optics alone shifted the entire conversation. The shared Slavic background between Poles and Ukrainians helped, to an extent. Polish and Ukrainian, they're not mutually intelligible, but they're close enough that refugees could pick up basic phrases. More importantly, Poland already had 1.3 million Ukrainian workers before the war. The existing infrastructure for cooperation and integration proved pivotal, something that refugees fleeing from elsewhere just didn't have the luxury of. But from the government's perspective, nothing overshadowed the political dimension. This wasn't some distant conflict, it was next door, perpetrated by Russia, Poland's longtime historical oppressor. The 20th century had seen Poland erased from the map, brutally occupied by Russia and Germany, then subjected to a Soviet puppet government for decades. And while that may have been the worst suffering at Moscow's hands, centuries prior also saw their fair share of Russian aggression. While they emphasized the importance of respecting Kiev's sovereignty, the proximity and historical oppression they themselves have experienced at Moscow's hands undoubtedly strengthens their resolve to make sure Putin doesn't get any ideas of a future special military operation. Supporting Ukraine meant opposing Russia, a cause that unites Poland across every political division. When Poles saw Russian tanks rolling toward Kiev in 2022, they weren't just watching news, they were watching their own history being replayed next door. Even Poland's fractious political parties achieved something unprecedented: unanimous parliamentary support for refugee assistance. Every single party, from far left to far right, voted yes. The political factor was felt societally, not just in government circles. Polling showed 94% of citizens supported accepting Ukrainian refugees at a time of widespread political division over immigration. This is an astonishing figure. It approaches Saddam Hussein levels of support, but in this case, it's actually real. Poland's selective solidarity extends beyond Ukraine to other states facing Russian aggression. When Belarus's Lukashenko stole the 2020 election and brutally suppressed protests, Poland became the default safe haven for fleeing dissidents. Over 30,000 Belarusians sought refuge there between 2020 and 2023, with Poland granting protection to 98% of applicants in 2023 alone, the highest acceptance rate for any nationality. The acceptance rate data reveals Poland's strategic calculations. In 2023, they granted protection to 98% of Belarusian applicants, but only 24% of Russians, despite both groups fleeing the same authoritarian system. Afghan allies, who worked with NATO forces, achieved a 97% acceptance rate, reflecting Warsaw's commitment to those who served alongside Polish forces. This pattern suggests Poland's refugee policy isn't purely about cultural or religious compatibility. Yes, proximity and shared history matter, hence the warm welcome for Ukrainians and Belarusians. But geopolitical alignment plays an equally important role. Afghans who supported NATO's missions earned protection despite coming from a Muslim-majority country thousands of miles away. Russians fleeing Putin's regime, meanwhile, face skepticism despite their European background. Poland's message is clear. We'll protect those who share our enemies or serve our interests regardless of where they are from. Again, the political realities of the situation almost certainly played a role in this. Belarus is one of Moscow's last remaining allies and largely functions as a sort of puppet state, with Lukashenko towing Moscow's line on just about everything. It should come as little surprise that Warsaw has actually become the seat of government in exile, led by opposition politician Swiatlana Tsikhanouskaya. Yet despite this warm welcome, it nevertheless would prove to be something of a honeymoon phase rather than a lasting commitment, at least for some. Support for accepting Ukrainians dropped from 94% at the start of the war down to just over half by late last year. Polish truckers blockaded border crossings over what they believed to be unfair competition, and farmers dumped Ukrainian grain in protest of import rules. Even still, the fact that Poles were so much more willing to accept Ukrainian refugees than their Middle Eastern counterparts is telling. Early on, the government recognized this and in doing so has been far more successful at blocking an insurgent far-right wing from taking form in the country. In 2019, David Frum wrote something that scandalized polite opinion but proved rather prophetic. To quote him, "If liberals won't enforce borders, fascists will." Across Europe, this prediction has proven devastatingly accurate. Traditional parties that ignored voter concerns about immigration have watched anti-immigration movements capture unprecedented power. But Poland found a third way: mainstream parties enforcing borders strictly enough that extremists can't gain traction. The numbers tell the story better than any argument. Germany's Alternative for Deutschland now polls at 26% nationally in recent Forza polling, leading the CDU-CSU at 24%. Just think about that. A party that German domestic intelligence partly classifies as extremist is Germany's most popular party. In Saxony and Brandenburg, they captured over 30% of votes. France's National Rally and its far-right allies hold 143 seats in parliament, making it the largest single party. This is Marine Le Pen's movement, so toxic that mainstream parties unite to defeat it, yet it has now been normalized enough to be seen as the primary opposition. The Netherlands went even further. Geert Wilder's party for freedom won the most seats in the entire parliament. A similar phenomenon has popped up across the continent, but nowhere is this more true than in the United Kingdom. Indeed, it's dramatic enough that we here at Political Fronts have dedicated an entire video to it. The reasons there, as well as throughout the continent, are myriad and expand beyond merely migration, but that issue nevertheless played a central role in the development of these new parties. The British Conservative Party, one of the most electorally successful parties in global history, could very well be seeing its final demise at the hands of longtime outsider Nigel Farage's insurgent Reform UK. In June 2025 polling, Reform UK hit 34%, 9 points ahead of Labour, and the Tories fell to a staggering third-place finish at just 15%. Prime Minister Farage is becoming more and more of a real future with every passing day. The tragedy for these mainstream parties is that they have tried to adapt lately, but it appears to be too late, at least in some countries. The association has already been made in voters' minds, with confidence in their ability to deliver on promises made during campaigns waning by the day. Germany's CDU is struggling to distance itself from the less popular policies of the Merkel era, which aren't entirely about migration, but certainly include it. The British Conservatives spent over a decade promising to reduce immigration to tens of thousands, while presiding over year after year of record numbers. Voters who wanted moderate immigration reform were effectively pushed away from the mainstream parties and into the arms of those on the fringe, not as a first choice, just as a last resort. Once there, though, it proves to be pretty damn impossible to get them back. Consider the credibility gap that's open for parties across Europe. The UK Conservative Party spent 15 years promising to cut net migration to the tens of thousands. They said this while campaigning in 2010, 2015, 2017, 2019. Instead, they presided over record highs: 764,000 in 2022, 685,000 in 2023. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak made Stop the Boats one of the 5 core pledges, and that didn't exactly age well. Germany's CDU faces a different but equally damaging legacy problem. After 16 years under Merkel, they're inextricably linked to the 2015 decision that let over 1 million migrants into the country. Recent promises from new leadership to take a more balanced approach, more restrictive than the Merkel era, less anti-immigration than the AfD would propose, increasingly seem to be falling on deaf ears. Consider the timeline. The CDU only began seriously discussing migration restrictions after the AfD was making inroads as the anti-immigration party. The Tories only got tough on immigration after the disastrous collapse in last year's election. These delayed pivots looked like panic, not principle, and that appears to be how electorates are reading them too. Polls show that both Reform UK and the AfD are the single most popular parties in their respective countries, though still falling short of majority. Yet Poland's charted something of a different course, with much different results. There is a far right in the country called the Confederation. Unlike their Western European counterparts, though, they hold a mere 18 out of 460 parliamentary seats. That's less than 4%. In terms of the popular vote, they consistently poll under 10%, sometimes dropping down to 5 or 6%. They're not exactly on the rise, as may be the case throughout much of the continent. While Poland's larger far-right party can't exactly be called liberal, Law and Justice systematically undermined judicial independence during their 2015 to 2023 rule. They packed the Constitutional Tribunal, politicized the Judicial Council, and created a disciplinary chamber to punish dissenting judges. The 2020 muzzle law that penalised judges for questioning appointments drew EU sanctions, with the European Court of Justice imposing fines of up to €1 million a day. These challenges are concerning and could lead to ominous implications in the future. And yet, despite all of this, law and justice are still significantly less radical than something like the AfD and represent less of a clean break with Polish governance than something like Reform UK. This is, in part, due to the comparatively new democracy that they have, but it also gets to a point that there is no insurgent semi-revolutionary party calling for completely doing away with much of how the country has operated over the last several decades, if not longer. So why has Poland had such a different experience, and can it hold? The answer reveals something profound about political strategy. Poland's mainstream parties, from the conservative Law and Justice to Donald Tusk's Liberals, converged on immigration restriction early and comprehensively enough that the extremists were effectively disarmed. The only thing radical about this approach is just how different it is to Western Europe. When Law and Justice took power in 2015, they did make waves by reversing the previous government's decision to accept 6,500 refugees, ultimately taking in 0. But their goals on migration were neither radical nor revolutionary. Once you factor in the low migration the country was used to, their approach was relatively mainstream. They strengthened border security along the Belarus frontier, maintained the belief that EU membership and solidarity couldn't override national sovereignty on immigration. Regardless of where you stand on these issues, they resonated domestically. Polls consistently showed 70% or more in the country backed the moves. Law and Justice, while never achieving anywhere near a 70% approval rating, largely thanks to their more controversial approaches to other issues, had effectively co-opted the far right entirely. Confederation found itself with nowhere to grow. What was the point of their existence? Sure, they tried some theatrical displays of genuine extremism in an attempt to get some of the true believers to cross over, calling for investigating all Muslims, closing all borders. You get the picture. Now, it largely went nowhere. Here's where Poland's story gets really interesting, though. Even when Law and Justice lost parliamentary power in 2023, the country's immigration policies didn't shift nearly as much as many international observers thought that they would. Donald Tusk, the man who had served as the president of the European Council and played a central role in Brexit negotiations from the EU side, became Poland's prime minister. This man was the archetypal EU liberal, and it had been his party, Civic Platform, which had originally agreed to take in migrants back in 2015. For many, the question was less if he was going to shift Poland's migration policies, and more a question of just how much. Instead, Tusk learned from his 2015 defeat. Back then, his party's agreement to accept the EU's refugee quota had become a political lightning rod. Law and Justice made immigration the defining issue and rode it to victory. So when Tusk returned to power in 2023, he triangulated brilliantly, maintaining the hardline border policies, but wrapping them in economic pragmatism rather than cultural nationalism. Within weeks of taking office, his government announced that it would continue border pushbacks and maintain the physical barriers erected during the Belarus crisis. Then last October, when Belarus ramped up its hybrid warfare again, Tusk went even further than his predecessors. He announced Poland would temporarily suspend the right to asylum entirely. Quote, "We know perfectly well how Lukashenko, Putin, migrant brokers, and human traffickers use it. The way asylum rights are being used is completely contrary to the actual essence of the right to asylum. I'm saying loud and proud that our migration strategy will include the temporary suspension of the right to asylum on our territory." Not exactly what I'd expect to hear from the leader of a centre to centre-left coalition, is this? But Tusk coupled this with selective openness where it served Polish interests. His government expanded EU blue cards for tech workers, about 7,000 in 2023. They recruited Vietnamese nurses for elderly care, Filipino construction workers, and Ukrainian tech specialists. The key word being selective. Poland would choose who comes and for what purpose, not accept open-ended refugee obligations from Brussels. This approach is not exclusively based on saying no, though. Poland has steadily increased its humanitarian aid to conflict zones, contributing a record $3.7 million to UNHCR in 2024. The Warsaw Doctrine, if you will, may very well be, we'll help, but it'll be over there, not here. This approach has its critics, but there's logic to it. Polish officials argue they're addressing root causes of migration. After all, many would prefer to remain home if conditions improved. The question is whether aid alone can substitute for refuge obligations. Germany and Sweden both donate generously overseas while also accepting refugees. Poland has been generous in funding overseas to address these issues, but they're far more selective in accepting them into their home. This path might have proved popular domestically, but the demographics in Poland tell an ominous story for a country so reluctant to accept migrants. As we've previously covered on this channel, Japan has pursued one of the most anti-immigration approaches of any country we can find amidst collapsing birth rates, with rather disastrous effects. While some countries are trying to roll out policies to boost domestic birth rates, whether or not they will be able to succeed remains to be seen. The numbers tell a story here. Poland's birth rate has collapsed to 1.2 children per woman, well below replacement level. The workforce is aging rapidly, which will put more stress on their retirement benefit system as fewer and fewer people are paying into their benefit system. Eventually, Poland will face the same choices as every other developed nation: accept demographic decline or accept increased immigration, at least to some extent. For now, though, Poland's approach continues to function as intended. President Karol Nawrocki, inaugurated this month with backing from Law and Justice, has pledged to veto any legislation that would facilitate accepting asylum seekers from the Middle East or Africa. Any shift in migration policies seems unlikely. Poland's refugee paradox reveals something profound about how democracies navigate between compassion and self-preservation. A country that welcomed over 1 million Ukrainians while deploying troops against a few thousand Middle Eastern migrants isn't experiencing cognitive dissonance. It's executing a deliberate strategy that reflects anti-migration views along with the political realities on the ground. The selectivity is night and day. Belarusians have a 98% acceptance, 97% for Afghan NATO allies, but just 18% for Russians and near zero for Middle Eastern immigrants arriving by way of Belarus. The lesson here isn't that Poland has found the perfect solution. The lost lives along the border are tragic, and its falling birth rates are a problem that can hardly be ignored. And yet Poland has bought itself time. While time will only tell if the new president, Nawrocki, will pose a challenge to their institutions, they nevertheless have to be recognized for being able to stave off the far right from making much of an inroad. Sure, the Confederation have a few seats in parliament, from which they are all too happy to spout out various extremist policies and rhetoric, but so far, they've largely fallen on deaf ears. David Frumm's warning that if liberals won't enforce borders, fascists will, has proven prophetic across Europe. Poland's response might not be entirely admirable, but it has been effective. In a continent watching democracy strain under increasing populist pressure, effectiveness might carry more weight than ideological purity. Whether such a shift is reassuring or terrifying will likely depend on which side of the border you're standing on. But for Poland's mainstream parties, the calculation is clear. Better to be accused of heartlessness by Brussels than to watch extremists march through Warsaw's streets, carrying torches as they have done in other European capitals. Thank you for watching.